Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the virtual reality of the Mershon Center of International Security Studies at Ohio State. My name is Matt Coleman, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography at Ohio State. Go Bucks! We are here this morning for the inaugural talk in a series that my geography colleague, Kendra McSweeney, and I have put together, there's Kendra, on what we're calling the legal geopolitics of the ocean. Practically what we're doing through this series, which is generously funded by the Mershon Center, is hosting 8 speakers over Zoom. And then at the end of our Zoom talks, all those speakers are going to come to Ohio State for a mini conference. And that mini conference is going to be structured around a bunch of conversations between our speakers based on their video presentations, which is, I think, going to be really fun, lively, mostly unscripted event, which is sort of not the way we usually do so-called mini conferences. So stay tuned for that. Now, thematically, what we're doing is, or at least hoping to do through these talks, is engage and extend new research on oceans as legal, geopolitical, logistical, and lived spaces. When Kendra and I started doing our own work on the oceans, we were struck by the preponderance of literature which treats oceans as anarchic and sort of unlived and empty spaces. And through this series, what we're trying to do is treat the ocean differently as something which is claimed, legally claimed, geopolitically claimed, capitalized, and in some instances, even embodied, lived. Professor Laleh Khalili is kicking off our series, but before I formally introduce Professor Khalili, let me say briefly that we will be hosting geographers Philip Steinberg and Kimberly Peters in early February as part of this series to talk about critical ocean geographies. And then after that, we're hosting Catherine McKittrick, Allison Mann, Sasha Davis, May Miller, and the forensic oceanographers duo Lorenzo Pisani and Charles Heller. So please stay tuned for all those talks. And again, all those people will be coming to Ohio State at some point.
So exciting.
Yeah, it will be exciting. I also really want to recognize and thank Mershon postdoc Zainab Qadri for her help. Zainab on the screen, her help in organizing these events. Kendra and I will be absolutely nowhere without your guiding hand. So thanks very much. And also thanks to Danny Wallerman for facilitating this event behind the scenes and all the other wonderful staff at Mershon. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce Laleh Khalili, the Al-Qasimi Professor of Gulf Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and Director of the Center of Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter in Devon, which is in Southwest England. We're all geographers here. Professor Khalili's research is focused on colonial forms of power, political violence, political economy, race, and most recently, of course, in this wonderful book, Capital and Cargo. Now, in addition to her many journal articles, Professor Khalili has written a number of terrific books, including Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine in 2007 on Cambridge, Time in the Shadows in Stanford in 2013. She is co-editor of Policing and Prisons in the Middle East in 2010. And again, this book, Sinews of War and Trade on Verso in 2020. And as I was saying earlier on this Zoom, we actually met as a small group last night to discuss that book, and we had a wonderful discussion. So my first encounter with Professor Khalili was actually by virtue of a former postdoc, Lisa Bongalia. So I want to give shouts out to Lisa, who is now an assistant professor in geography at Kent State. And in 2014, Lisa suggested to me very kindly that I pick up a copy of Time in the Shadows and read it with her. This is Time in the Shadows, and read it with her. At that point, I was really quite interested in immigration enforcement and detention. And so for those of you who haven't read Time in the Shadows, it's really a richly detailed account of the use of confinement at the heart of two so-called liberal counterinsurgencies, the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories and the U.S. war on terror. Content aside, the book is wonderful. And actually, one of the things that occurred to me last night when we were reading the more recent book is the continuity between the two is that ports as well are sort of forms of containment and exclusion and share some characteristics of apartness and secrecy and surveillance. So that's an interesting continuity between the two books. Professor Khalili's talk today is called The Corporeal Life of Seafaring, which is also the title of her forthcoming book on a cool independent visual arts and literary theory press called MAC. And I have pre-ordered that, and I'm looking forward to seeing what it sort of aesthetically looks like and feels like. That book will soon be available. I'm super excited to get it, and I'm super excited to listen and learn this morning. So let's have a warm welcome for Professor Khalili. And although I promise it's not so warm right now because we can't hear anybody, but it will be much warmer when we actually get you here to Buckeye Land. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Matt and Kendra. Thank you, and Zainab. Thank you so much for organizing my talk. And Danny, you are like a goddess of efficiency and organization. It has been just incredibly smooth. So thank you very much for all of that. I also, before I start the talk, I think it's really, really important to declare my solidarity with Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, because I think what is going on is unspeakable. Okay, so as Matt mentioned, and again, I'm really grateful both to be invited here to give this talk and for the extremely exciting proposition of getting together in OSU with a number of really amazing colleagues. This talk is a shorter version of a book that is coming out. And in fact, the book is organized very differently than the way that this talk is. But this talk began because I was curious about the condition of seafarers on board ships. And so it ends up being extended into a book. But what I'll be doing now is I'll be turning on the slideshow. The slideshow is going to show a series of images from a couple of container ship trips that I took. And it doesn't necessarily directly correlate to what I'm talking about at that moment, but I figured it would be much more exciting to look at that or look at these pictures than to look at me. So there you go. Okay, so this is going to start just rotating every 20 seconds. And if you can move the image, you can move the little boxes that has my picture on it over so that it doesn't cover the caption. Okay, now this talk could have two different kinds of starts. The first one is a really grim story of flesh ripping apart in explosions. The second one will begin ironically towards the end of this talk, as I ask you, the audience, about what direction this talk should take. Okay, so in early 1985, as the tanker war between Iran and Iraq reached its first of several crescendos, Reverend Ernie Arnold of the Mission to Seamen in Dubai recounted a horrifying incident in his monthly report. Now, the Mission to Seafarers is an organization that provides solace to seafarers, particularly in places where seafarers unions are not allowed to be. And although it used to be an evangelical mission of the Anglican Church, established about 150 years ago, in 2000, it essentially incorporated as an NGO, as a support NGO. So this report is from 1985, and Reverend Ernie Arnold was in Dubai. And this is what he writes to London. He says, a badly damaged firefighting support vessel has been brought in to Dubai, and it was believed to have been hit by Iranian missiles. And this is his quote. The ship was a mass of twisted and burnt wreckage. The survivors and the two dead seamen had been taken off in Bahrain, and the captain was missing, presumed blown into the water, and then the ship was towed to Dubai. Last Tuesday, 9 days after the boat came to dock in Dubai, I received a telephone call from the local ship's manager who wanted to see me urgently. He then told me that someone had discovered signs of human flesh in the shattered wheelhouse, and that the captain was somewhere there. I just imagine that. In the local situation, there could be no help from either the police or hospitals to help in the recovery, so it fell upon the local manager to do the job. It ended up with him, a doctor, and myself spending about 3.5 hours on Thursday gathering together what we were able to find by sorting through the ashes and other remains in the wheelhouse. That evening, just before the light failed, we took about 3/4 of a bin liner rubbish bag, out to the Indian burning place and placed it upon a funeral pyre and read the committal service, end quote. This is really pretty harrowing stuff. During the tanker wars, Iran and Iraq targeted ships lifting oil from ports belonging to the enemy and its allies. In the final 4 years of the war, Iran and Iraq attacked ships 411 times, with Iraq responsible for 60% of the attacks. The harrowing reports from the mission to seafarers in Bahrain and Dubai recording these attacks have a baroque quality. They include stories of death, injury, fire and destruction, and of fear. Month after month, the monthly reports brim with seafarers' intense fear of sailing into the Gulf under tankers, supply vessels, and cargo ships. This torn apart, bloodied, fearful, terrorized seafarer is absent in so many of the accounts of the tanker wars. And indeed, right now, as the Russians, for example, have been attacking the Ukrainian and other ships in the Black Sea, what you do hear is about the grain ships being hit or the ships themselves being hit, but you don't hear about the seafarers that have been hit. So this talk is about the embodied, the corporeal life of seafarers upon the deep. When I first traveled on a freighter, the shipping agent who had arranged my travel booked me into a seafarers hotel in Malta. I met a large number of Filipino and Eastern European seafarers at the Sailors Hotel in port of Marsaxlokk, about 10 miles southeast of the Maltese capital, Valletta. They were mostly quiet and polite young men, mostly in their 20s and 30s, and they socialized with their own countrymen, speaking in Croatian or Tagalog. As I learned later aboard the ship, nationalities structured their conviviality in ways that their social class, rank, or ratings, or their wages, did not. In the mornings when I came down to the Spartan dining room for breakfast, the seafarers on their way home after 4 or 9 month stints at sea were often hungover. Those arriving at the hotel with its bare rooms and creaky single beds to board ships for 4 or 9 month stints seemed restless and anxious. The seafarers gazed at me curiously whenever they encountered me, and I imagine they must have wondered what I was doing there amongst them, this lone woman, older than most of them by a decade or two, and definitely a landlubber. They mostly left me alone. I had arrived in Marsaxlokk at the end of January 2015, planning to steam on a freighter, the massive CMA-CGM container ship Corporeal. CMA-CGM is the world's third largest shipping company after the Danish Maersk and the Italian MSC, which frequently swap places at the top 2 places on the list. The stylish headquarters of CMA-CGM is designed by architect Zaha Hadid, and it sits overlooking the port in Marseille, France. But their shipping hub is located in Marsaxlokk, about 700 miles offshore. Malta's island location, equidistant from both the European and North African coasts, and its extant infrastructures, including its character as something of an offshore haven within the European Union, make it a perfect transshipment port. Transshipment ports receive massive container ships like CMA-CGM Corporeal, which was 365 meters in length, or about 1,000 feet in length, and capable of carrying 14,000 containers or more than 150,000 tons of goods, and distribute some of their goods to the nearby coast via smaller ships. The ships then can sail to the industrial ports of northwestern Europe or towards the East Asian ports that dispatch the goods produced in the factory of the world, China. 3 days after arriving in Marsaxlokk, I was finally given the signal to board the ship. That was the beginning of the first of 2 journeys, 20 months apart, from Malta to Jebel Ali in Dubai on 2 different container ships. The 2 journeys were radically different in many ways, even if their starting and end points were the same. One took place at a peak in global trade, and the ship steamed through the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Oman, and the Persian Gulf at breakneck speed, with very few intermediate stops, only to be forced to remain at anchor off the coast of Jebel Ali, Dubai, waiting for a berth to come free because it was so busy. The second journey came during a dip in global trade and took much longer. And the ship, CMA CGM Callisto, took in a number of other ports, including Damietta in Egypt, Beirut in Lebanon, Mersin in Turkey, and Jeddah in Saudi Arabia before arriving at its destination. During both journeys, I spent hours every day speaking to the seafarers in the wheel room or on the deck, and less frequently in the engine room. I ate all my meals with the officers and socialized with the crew after hours. This lecture draws on those weeks of ethnography, as well as archival research, and also a deep dive into literary texts that cover something of that experience of embodiment. The argument that I want to make is that to understand the working of the global trade, of the macro-historical gargantuan movements of capital, cargo, and people across oceans, it helps to zoom in on the micro-political or the embodied lives of seafarers at sea, on the quotidian life of labor, tedium, longing, loneliness, and camaraderie aboard ships today. The work that seafarers do, but the work that we all do, is imprinted on the body and on our affects and on our thoughts. Life aboard a ship transforms lives and bodies and personhoods, but these transformations are shaped by the environment that seafarers inhabit, the times in which they live, the spaces they traverse, and the rules that structure their day-to-day labor. The mega freighters of today, like the whalers Herman Melville wrote about in Moby Dick, my favorite novel, are in some ways some of the most transnational microenvironments in the world. And the human-sized experiences of racialization at work, the embodied and affective experiences of striated social relations aboard the ship, all trace the shifting terrain of racial capitalism in our time. So what I will do today in this talk is to describe the historical trajectory and transformation of what Marcus Rediker has called a life ruthlessly subordinated to work aboard ships in a lot of the world, but in the Western Indian Ocean in particular, which is where I have worked. Now, ships have been called total institutions. Wilhelm Obert, a Norwegian sociologist who had researched seafarers aboard oil tankers in the 1950s and 1960s, described their remoteness at sea, qualifying them to be a kind of a hidden society. Vivek Bald, who's an historian of South Asian migration to Harlem, agrees and describes the turn-of-century seafarers as, what he says, a semi-captive and hyper-exploited but globally mobile workforce. And I think that description is absolutely spot on even today. The ships on which I steamed were modern mega freighters that flew the British Red Ensign. I think you probably saw in a couple of slides back the red flag flying. This matters because the flag under which a ship is registered determines which country's labor, environmental, and tax laws the ship will abide by. The 20th century invention of flags of convenience or open registries has unmoored ships' ownership structures from the flag it flies. So a lot of ships in the world don't actually carry, so a French ship doesn't necessarily have to carry the flag of France. And in fact, CMA CGM has loads of ships that carry particularly the flags of the Panamas, the Bahamas, Liberia, and Marshall Islands. Those are the 4 biggest flags of convenience. Part of the reason that flags of convenience emerged was in order to loosen the hold of tightening labor laws, union scrutiny, environmental inspections, and state tax claims on shipping companies throughout the 20th century. It is no surprise then that the first ships that flew the flags of the earliest open registries are the transnational companies that were based on exploitation of resources elsewhere and exploitation of labor at home and elsewhere. In Honduras and Panama, United Fruits banana boats and Standard Oil's tankers, as I said, flew the flags of Honduras and Panama in order to avoid those scrutinies around labor, environmental regulations and taxes. However, being under the red ensign for me, red ensign, meant that I was on a well-inspected ship that could arrive in British ports and where working conditions were better than most. But it is important to note that even European states with relatively better regulations now have international registries that have laxer rules aboard ships. Even more vexing, the Global Union Federation's struggle against the flags of convenience has itself not been without its controversies over the question of transnational asymmetries of power and access to shipboard employment. What the move to international registries has translated to is that limitations on the employment of foreign nationals aboard ships have been removed, but without requirements that seafarers be paid at the same wage scale as national seafarers. So under flags of convenience, a French-owned ship can fly a Panamanian or Liberian flag and pay the seafarers a fraction of what a French seafarer would have demanded. The international registries of European states also aspire to a degree of flexibility in labor arbitrage, but are more limited by residual labor regulations. The ships I journeyed on were officered by Croatian officers, who are now less expensive than German or British officers would have been, and were crewed by Filipino seafarers. The Philippines provides the largest percentage of seafarers in the world, though China is fast catching up, and Russia, India, and Indonesia are not far behind. The Filipino seafarers on board the two CMA-CGM ships I sailed were on very long contracts. They were 9 months aboard the ship and 1 month off, while the Croatian officers had 4-month-long contracts, with the captain being on a 2-month contract and being permitted to bring his wife along on at least one journey per year. In my conversations with the seafarers, it became clear that many of the Filipino, Chinese, and Asian men came not from port cities, but hinterland agricultural towns and villages, and aimed to save money in order to return home, pay off debts, and start businesses at home. Aboard the ship, work for seafarers, many of whom are accustomed to hardship on land or in factories, would be even more backbreaking, constant, and tedious than their previous experiences. On today's container ships, tankers, with vehicle carriers, and bulk carriers, though many tasks have been mechanized, labor is still very repetitive, and especially when arriving at or departing ports, stressful. The engine room of container ships are hellishly hot places, and like the old coal bunkers below the sea level and subsurface. The engine room is not only not the sooty coal storage of the days of steam. It is gleaming and metallic. You can in fact see an image of it right now. And the heat reflects off the instruments and machinery. The pipes and machines in the room where the lubricating oil is heated to 135 degrees centigrade before it lubricates the engine are wrapped in heat-proof foil. And still the place scorches, especially as we go through the steamy heat of the Red Sea. The dozen or so men who worked in the engine room are artisans doing meticulous repair work on the broken parts of the sophisticated and massive engine. In the heated space below deck, the engineers and electricians ensure that the ship moves forward in the sea with the thrum of the engine reassuringly constant. Above deck, on the container ship, the deck crew fight a constant war to contain the damage to salt-encrusted and rust-caked walls and body of the ship. Sanding and washing and painting never ends, and the ships are so vast that by the time the whole of the ship has been cleaned and repainted, the work needs to recommence. In addition, deck sailors have to regularly keep watch over the refrigerated containers to ensure that their temperatures are suitably cold. In the wheel room, the tedium of daily work has to do with endless paperwork. The first mate has to cut and paste new instructions and changes on the maps that they use. In my case, it was the Admiralty charts, maps issued by the Admiralty or the Department of Navy in Britain. Messages from port control or various maritime security organizations have to be received and filed. When arriving or leaving ports or crossing canals, paperwork has to be filled and filed. Hefty binders full of certificates and paperwork jostle for space on the shelves of the wheelroom with instruction manuals and shipping directories. At sea, the officers in the whale room have to mostly keep watch, looking to long distances and their various screens to ensure the ship never gets too close to another ship or to reefs and ridges and islands and submerged volcanoes. The nature of sociability on board the ship has also changed from old times. In the ships I traveled on, European seafarers would gather in the officers' sitting room, drink beers, and watch recordings of football games, films, and television shows in Serbo-Croat. In the cruise room in my first journey, I was invited to karaoke sessions because Filipino crew members often requested karaoke machines as part of their contracts. On the second journey, however, CMA-CGM had extended satellite internet connections to the seafarers. Before that, only the captain had access to satellite wavelengths and would gather up emails and communications and load them up in bulk once a day. But once the crew had access to internet, the socializing around karaoke pop songs seemed to have receded, as often the seafarers stayed in their cabins, conversing with their family members, cruising the web, and watching porn, things they had only been able to do at port, and even then at great expense. As both the historian of sailing ships and sociologist of contemporary tankers, Marcus Rediker and Wilhelm Obert have written, the closed nature of the ship, its often week-long isolation at sea, and the perpetual intimacy of workers at work and at home in the same total institution means that sometimes the seafarers wanted to escape one another by retiring to their shared cabins to speak to their families. But to me, it seemed that although the men could connect to their partners and children and families far more easily, and most beamed while showing me photographs of their children that they had captured on Skype, which was what they used at the time, their lives aboard the ship had become more solitary and less sociable. But life aboard ship wasn't about the daily organization of work and the interactions between crew and officers. Perhaps because the ship is a living microcultural, micropolitical system in motion, according to Paul Gilroy in his Black Atlantic, and because it acts not only as a place of work, but the place of living and leisure, it also transforms the bodies of seafarers in perceptible ways, like physically transforms their bodies. In his study of British colonialism in the Indian Ocean, the great maritime historian Frank Brose has called seafarers the muscles of empire. Although, of course, this is metaphorical, I really quite like it because it, in fact, does also directly and literally describe the ways in which seafarers have worked. I want to start with a little passage from the old steamships, the burnt coal, because I think that in some ways they say something about the ways in which the bodies changed at that time. The coal burning steamships often had stokers or firemen and trimmers. Trimmers were seafarers that worked below the surface of the sea and carried the coal from the coal house to the engine. Stokers or firemen were the ones who put the coal inside the engine. This group was called the Black Gang because of the way their skins were perpetually coated in coal dust. But it also had an interesting metaphorical example because often they were recruited from South Asia, Africa, or Yemen, and therefore the moniker of Black also had something to do with the ways in which they were racialized. In his magisterial account of South Asian shipboard labor, Gopalan Balakrishnan describes the work. He says that these steam engines were scalding hot workplaces where temperatures could exceed 60 degrees centigrade. That's about 120 degrees, a little bit more than 120 degrees, especially in the Red Sea. Burning, scalding, and heat asphyxiation were a common lot of engine room crews, particularly in the Mediterranean and in tropical waters. To the dangers of accidental death in the engine room, one may add that of being crushed by sudden shifts in heaving masses of coal. Coal bunkers would be at considerable distance from the engine room on large vessels, with depleting coal stocks further increasing the distance as the voyage progressed. Trimmers, the people who carried the coal, developed permanent bruises or badges on the sides of their shoulders from knocking repeatedly against narrow heaving walkways whilst attempting to balance themselves against the roll and pitch of the vessel as they wheeled coal from the bunkers to the engine room. The trimmers, who were the lowest paid men on the ship, literally bore the marks of their work on their bodies. There were other ways in which work at sea transformed bodies. Seafarers working aboard the massive freighters of today do not have the gait of the sailors of yore, who walked on land as they did aboard the ships, keeping the body in balance, legs apart. But there was a time that the wide gait of sailors hinted at not only their quotidian walk aboard ships, but also embodied masculinities. The great chronicler of capitalism, Honoré de Balzac, has described this wide stance, and I quote, "Sailors remain with legs apart and always ready to bend or contract. Obliged to sway about on the deck with the swell of the waves, they are rendered incapable of walking straight on dry land. With all this sidestepping, they would do well to become diplomats," end quote. Interestingly, I also recently discovered that apparently the gait and feelings of seasickness are intensified for women on menopause. So there's a really interesting way in which this is really very embodied. But with the ship being flat-bottomed and heavily laden, walking on deck is not that different than walking on land, unless the sea is stormy, and not always then either. But there are other ways that the ship and the seafarers have shaped their bodies around this. Most ships contain gymnasia in which cardio and table tennis equipment are provided alongside weightlifting paraphernalia. On both ships, the European and Filipino seafarers had different ways of crafting their bodies according to their own masculine ideas. The Croatian officers were to a person muscular and spent hours pumping iron. Even the woman cadet on the first ship I journeyed on had a muscular upper body and prided herself in having physical strength and being able to lift above expected for her weight band. By contrast, the Filipino seafarers preferred cardio work or playing table tennis, and their idea of strength was not necessarily related to being muscular or top-heavy. As ethnographer of Filipino seafarers, KB Fallardo has beautifully described the ways in which sailors and tomboys an ethnographer of Filipino seafarers, KB Fallardo, has beautifully described the ways in which seafarers and tomboys craft alternate forms of masculinity that challenge the neoliberal modality exported worldwide through practices of body making and reinforced by the Philippine state through heteronormative and masculinist structuring of maritime education. So it is a paradox of shipboard life also that loneliness is a pivotal characteristic of a place where physical intimacy defines the day-to-day interactions of the seafarers. In his histories of seafarers on ships, Ravi Ahuja, historian, describes how this quotidian painful experience of confinement and monotony can lead to suicide or madness. He retells the story of one sailor who burned his own eyes out with caustic because he had seen the devil below the deck. This life of loneliness amidst intimacy, the feeling of confinement, and the slow submersion into madness, sea madness in particular, Fata Morgana as it's called, all continue to characterize life aboard the ships. In fact, a recent study commissioned by the International Transport Workers Federation has found that seafarers are the second largest population of workers on land or at sea prone to suicidal ideation at work. This vulnerability is no surprise. Aside from the context of isolation and confinement, combined with a kind of claustrophobic intimacy, the very embodied nature of work at sea, its everydayness, pervasiveness in time and place, transform even the most banal and taken for granted aspect of life. They make them not so ordinary. Eating is one such facet of life. No narrative of shipboard work is ever complete without a discussion of food and the rituals surrounding meals. Hierarchies are established through the differences in food provided to crews and officers. On the two ships on which I journeyed, the officers' mess was separated from the crew's dining room by the kitchen. So the kitchen was right in the middle, the officers were over here, and the crew were over there. The Filipino and other crew members ate together, and even the Filipino officers joined them rather than eat with the European officers. The officers' tables were set hierarchically, with the captain at the head and his first mates and the chief engineer on either side of him, and so on down the table. The passengers ate at separate tables with the officers and were served the same food as the officers. Our Filipino chef, who had served at several expensive hotels in Dubai and aboard a cruise ship, often prepared quite standard meat and 2 veg dishes for the officers. After a few days of quite boring meals, I timidly asked if I could be served what the crew was eating. The chef at first demurred, telling me that the Filipino curries had been made with the meat that was left over from the officers' meal the previous day. I finally prevailed in my argument, and for the rest of my journey was fed the most delicious adobos, curries, and various Southeast Asian stews that were far more delicious than the dull European menu. There, in the basic ingredients of the food, in the way that they were made, in how they were eaten, global hierarchies came to the fore. The crew's meals were made with leftovers of officers' meals, and hierarchies aboard the ship were trumped by national attachments, with the Filipino officers eating with their countrymen rather than with their officer cohort. But food is also something more banal and more non-negotiable. You need food to live. Historical accounts of shipboard life on the Indian Ocean abound with inadequate victualling of ships manned by South Asian seafarers, and intransigent owners refusing to increase rations by even the smallest margins. We know that as far back as early 19th century, it was a well-known fact that a paucity of certain nutrients could lead to beriberi or scurvy, and yet shipping firms were far too miserly to provide even the basic needs of their seafarers. In fact, shortage of food aboard was the most frequent cause of mutiny on ocean-going ships in the Indian Ocean. But the story of hunger ships are particularly relevant in the context of Arabian Peninsula. Because of absence of labor safeguards, the networks of capital accumulation often being densely interwoven with the royal courts, the absence of unionization, and severe limitations on the activities of other labor or seafarer rights groups, shipping firms located in the Arabian Peninsula have been especially notorious for running hunger ships. In Sinews of Foreign Trade, which Matt kindly mentioned, I tell the story of a Saudi-owned and flagged ship which operated a hunger ship in 1981, progressively cutting back the food budget over the course of weeks at sea, to the point that the seafarers had to improvise fishing nets so as not to starve. When they arrived in Rotterdam, the seafarers at last revolted, refusing to work. The shipping company, a Jeddah-based shipping company that was owned by an Al Saud prince, in turn brought a lawsuit against them in the Dutch courts for having refused to work. In the court proceedings that followed, the Dutch justice system dismissed the case that the Filipino seafarers had brought and argued that under Philippines law, Filipino seafarers were essential workers and therefore they were prohibited from striking. The seafarers were let go without any wages after having spent weeks hungry on board. The monthly reports of the Mission to Seafarers are similarly filled with tons of these stories. This is from 1981, but a more recent story is equally shocking. An Emirati firm called Elite Way Marine Services has a history of abandoning ships with seafarers on board. In 2017, the owners abandoned the crew of merchant vessel Azraq Moya, which carried building materials between Iraq and the UAE. When the carriage contract ended and they got paid, the ship's owners got paid by the Iraqis, the ship's owners abandoned the ship with 8 Indian, 1 Sudanese, and 1 Tanzanian crew member left at sea in Anchorage without being paid £260,000 in unpaid wages and without any food or fuel. Nor did they have any way to repatriate to their countries. To stave off starvation, the Mission to Seafarers and the Indian consulate provided them with rations of rice and dal, and the seafarers remained on board to maintain the ship and also to guarantee that they would get paid, because if they had left the ship, they would have forfeited their wages. After nearly 18 months at sea, the seafarers were finally repatriated with 40% of their wages. Now, this is one really egregious case, but there have been a number of other cases. And in fact, the situation is so bad that the ILO, the International Labour Organization, has a database of abandoned seafarers. You can access it. It's very easily Googleable. And there are hundreds of ships on board those, hundreds of ships in that database. So So this is a terrible story. But now, as I said at the beginning, I want to circle back and start the story in a different way. I gave a much earlier version of this talk in Rotterdam in 2020, right before the shutdowns, at an event organized by Erasmus University. Given that Rotterdam is the capital of shipping in Europe, a number of Dutch seafarers showed up to the talk. They were union men, all had served on ships, some still worked on shore. A couple worked for the Dutch equivalent of the Mission to Seafarers. One came up to me and exchanged the requisite niceties after the talk. Nervous about having given a talk to seafarers, I asked him what he thought. He demurred. So I pushed a bit more and he said to me, "The story you tell is a story of suffering. We are professionals. We're good at what we do. Without us, none of this," and his arm swept the amphitheater, "would be here." I have thought about that conversation with the former seafarer often. When I've been churlish, I have resorted to an all too simplistic response. Well, of course, he would talk about professionalism. He's not a relatively underpaid Filipino seafarer. Though ungenerous, this statement is not wrong. But it isn't the whole story. He was right. What I have delineated is a litany of suffering. Now, weirdly, I have often thought about the question of how do you represent a story? Do you represent it as suffering or do you represent it in another genre? In fact, my first book is entirely about the genres of storytelling, in this case, about Palestinians. I want to quote something from that because I think it does speak also to the ways in which I have presented this story. So in that first book, I talk about how discourses of suffering function in the context of Palestinian mobilization. Recognition of the suffering of ordinary people acknowledges their day-to-day sacrifices. It opens a space for the ordinary, often silent, though not always passive, majority, who are usually overshadowed in the self-congratulatory glare of heroic narratives. This discourse of suffering pulls back the curtain, concealing the costs of mobilization for the dispossessed, and demands the world to see and to act. But in doing so, it shifts the onus of action onto the international community, makes suffering itself a virtue, and denies the possibility of agency, mobilization, or collective action. The tragic discourse insists that the suffering of the past suffices as a necessary condition for acquiring rights in the future, and sometimes subverts the possibility of internal organization and mobilization. So, let's start again. On both my journeys, when the ship reached the pirate waters of the Gulf of Aden, just beyond the Bab el-Mandab and into the Indian Ocean, the ships went into an alert mode, with various safety measures being put into place. Among these were additional watchmen in the wheel room staring out to sea. Various openings on the lower decks were closed, and fire hoses and various defensive measures were wheeled out. Our ship's freeboard, the distance of the deck to the sea, was too high for most pirates, who catapult grappling hooks up onto the deck and climb on rope ladders. Russian and Israeli ships apparently carry armed guards, but our ship depended on the alertness of the seafarers. They have radar, global positioning systems, automatic identification systems, and other electronic equipment, which are supplemented with high-powered and heavy binoculars. But the seafarers had had their eyes trained to look out to the sea, exceeding the abilities of the sophisticated equipment. What astonished me is that they could see further and better than I could with binoculars. They could distinguish a pod of dolphins from a ship, from a fast-moving skiff in the distance. And they teased me that they could see skiffs, which are preferred pirate vessels, speeding towards us at 27 knots, twice the speed of our lumbering ship. This radical transformation of their sensorium, that the seafarers' eyes had been trained over the course of decades of work to see so far, speaks to the way our bodies are shaped through the habits of repetition and practice. I was also struck by the extent to which the Filipino seafarers insisted on maintaining and showing off their knowledge of navigation by stars. familiarity with the constellations and their seasonal revolutions, the directions to which they pointed, and the ability to read both altitude and latitude using analog instruments, and mastery of navigational astronomy seemed to be skills that the Filipino officers, but not the crew, were taught in their maritime academies. Unlike the younger European officers who had only been trained to work with digital navigation equipment. In 2015 and 16, when I was aboard the ship, we had news of ships whose digital navigation instruments had failed, and one instance where such failure had led to a US naval vessel colliding with another ship. In 2016, the US Navy had also reinstated the requirement for naval officers to relearn stellar navigation, navigation by stars, only 10 years after discontinuing it. Security concerns about hacking and spoofing of electronic navigation systems were behind this change in policy. In part, this equivocation on the respective role of this going back and forth between whether or not you are going to train an embodied form of knowledge also acknowledges the ways in which forms of knowledge are being outsourced to electronic instruments. With the coming, and you constantly hear about sort of laments about the loss of skills. So with the coming of steam, for example, one sees a proliferation of stories about the loss of knowledge about winds and currents. With metal-hulled ships, there comes concerns about loss of traditional skills in building wooden ships. New instrumentation creates worries about the ability to read maps or understand radio signals or navigate by the stars. And seafarers themselves are really worried about this because, of course, these forms are forms of skill which could be potentially outmoded. Yet, at the same time, that fear sits alongside the pride seafarers have in this form of artisanal skill. The ability not to just read a map on paper, but to locate oneself at sea using stars. The commercial benefits of such expertise are enriched by the cosmological connections it establishes between the seafarers and their environments. One of the officers who showed me his knowledge of the night sky, also in a rare moment of vulnerability, described how different the sky looked over his home village in the Philippines. The map of the stars wasn't just an industrial tool to him. It was also an embodied way in which he connected the isolated total institution of the ship to his home thousands of miles away. So in conclusion, in a meditation on Haiti and drawing on both Fanon and Césaire, Sylvia Wynter has written, "Human beings are magical. Bios and logos, words made flesh, muscle and bone animated by hope and desire, belief materialized in deeds, deeds which crystallize our actualities." This magical body that Wynter describes can be heroic or it can embody suffering, and it can do both at once. The world of commerce at sea has long written work, racialization, and gender on the body. The embodied corporeal work of the seafarers differs from space to space and time to time, from the stokehold and the deck to the hull and the wheel room. The hierarchies aboard the ships and on land shape these bodies and attempt to delimit their sensory and conceptual ability. The hardening of these limits happens through the uneven allocation of the very most basic needs of food, uncontaminated water, or a space to sleep in. The hardening of these spaces, these limits to sensory abilities, occurs via contracts that require some seafarers to stay at sea 9 months at a time when others can return home after 2. It shocks through the appearance of physical and verbal violence, of injuries and deaths and suicides at work. It courses through the maritime life in rivulets of tedium, loneliness, melancholy. But at the same time, it also exists through extraordinary abilities, skills, and artisanal pride. Life at sea hovers between the utopian life of openness and spaces of claustrophobia and power. What lies between these two spaces, between the here and now of contradictory realities and the horizon of the future, when the sea is not only a conduit of capital, cargo, humans as cargo, is the possibility of solidarity and conviviality at sea, but even more of revolt, a mutiny on land and sea that will show the infinity of our sensory and conceptual abilities. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Laleh. It was a really terrific.
Thank you.
What I think I'm going to do is give people a chance to collect their thoughts and maybe ask a question, and while everybody else has some time to jot down their notes, if that's okay, Kendra. Or Kendra, would you like to go?
Yes, because I have to step away to go to a conference with some grad students. So I was very glad I was able to hear the whole talk. That was so, there is a lot to think about, and I would like to digest things. But one quick question I have is, your photos are spectacular.
Thank you.
And one of the things as you were talking that struck me was how few people are represented.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could tell us your thinking there, because we are imagining bodies, but
they're not there.
But we're not seeing them. Yes.
Okay, so that's a brilliant question. Part of the reason that I have a ton of photos of people in them, but they show faces. And I never received consent from anybody to show their faces. And so I've not included any that has visible faces in them. I actually have an entire essay in which I talk about not representing bodies in these sort of gigantic things. So one of the photographers that I really like is Alan Sekula, who, he's got this amazing book called Fish Story. Also, he's got a number of other films and essay things, and he is very insistent on portraying people, and I love his work. But because I hadn't asked for consent from anybody to include their photographs, I ended up not including any of those also in this presentation, and which will appear in the book as well. So it was partially just because I never asked for consent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's funny, because I had something similar to ask. I mean, when I was looking at your photos, which again were marvelous, I was thinking about Charles Sheeler's paintings of the Ford River Rouge plant. And of course, the Ford River Rouge plant is sort of in between Lake St. Clair and the Big Lake. So it's very much a maritime environment. But of course, when Sheeler took the photos that he painted from, he organized for the workers to be disappeared from the landscape. So it was a sort of like intentional demographic removal, and then a sort of a representation of industry, which was really, without people, which is at odds, for instance, with Diego Rivera's representation of the very same plant, where people are put front and center, and the machines are in the behind. But much like Kendra, when I was looking at your photos, I was seeing a landscape where it's hard to grasp the labors. I mean, one of the things that you're doing is that, which I love, is that you're pointing to the ocean as an embodied space. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of millions of people who are on the seas laboring, if you were to think about all the kinds of boats that are out there. And yet, the photos you take, for instance, there was a picture of the Corfa Khan dock from 2015. So there were some cranes, the gantry cranes there, and some truck cranes, and the bodies are so dwarfed by the size of the machinery. Like, the machinery is just like massive. So I was wondering if you could just sort of comment on embodiment
in that context,
as a question of scale. I mean, it's sort of like,
So it is, I mean, there's something about being at sea in general that makes you feel very small. I had forgotten, because of light pollution, how many stars you can see. And it is extraordinary, to be out in the Mediterranean without any light pollution, and you look up and you can see like the most extraordinary images of the Milky Way. and you feel small and teeny, or for example, going for walks, around deck. It took quite a long time to walk around because, as I said, each the ship is 1,000 feet long, so it's almost a mile to go all the way around, and so. So there's a way that one feels teeny in comparison, not just with the ports and the massive gantry cranes and everything, but on the ship itself and at sea. So there is that element of one being dwarfed. And of course, I do write quite a bit about this in the much longer version in the book, about the scale of things having gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's a kind of a gigantism that happens in these cases, which goes hand in hand with also a massive reduction in the number of people who actually work on board the ship. So the ships get bigger and bigger, and the number of the people get smaller and smaller. And that is, I think, in part an effect of automation. It is in part the effect of capitalism and the economies of scale that goes hand in hand with the ships getting bigger while the numbers of people are getting smaller. But it is also, I think, the visual representation of it is also something that I've talked about before, which is that our, including mine, obsession with the sublime, with the gigantic, with the big, with the symmetrical, with the way that these ports, particularly the container ports, are astonishing to look at. They are aesthetically incredible. And if you are into that engineering sublime, into that sort of a machine sublime, then they are the ultimate in that kind of a representation. So in part, the visual representation inevitably leads to humans being dwarfed or being absent, in my case because of lack of consent, whereas I was hoping that through verbal representation I could at least show a little bit sort of apart from to in a sense set it apart, to provide some description of it verbally that you can't quite do visually.
Yeah, that's terrific. Danny, I have more, I could talk forever. I have more questions, but
there are a couple of questions I actually would be very happy to respond to. So Eileen Shaughnessy says that insisting on food privileges set you apart from your investigation, compromise your objectivity. Interesting question, because in fact what I was doing wasn't so much asking for privilege as asking to be demoted from privilege, because the crew were eating the leftovers of the officers, and I was asking to eat the crew's meals rather than the officers' meals. So in a sense, it wasn't so much asking for privilege as was asking not to have the privilege. In terms of objectivity, I don't really believe there being such a thing in research, particularly not in ethnographic research, in the sense that objective towards what? I got to eat the food of one, tried it, didn't particularly like it, asked to have the curries of the crew. What it did do was, in fact, if anything, it sort of enriched the investigation, because it let me have a sense of the way that the food was staged, so that the officers got the first run at, let's say, the roast meat, the roast beef or whatever, and then the leftovers from the roast beef were turned into a beef adobo the next day for the crew. And you get a sense of also the ways in which the chef on board is incredibly creative in planning meals in such a way that nothing goes to waste. They would have apples for breakfast if you missed the breakfast, and I often missed the breakfast because I didn't eat, and you could just go downstairs and then there were like leftover boiled eggs or apples that you could eat, and if the apples would go brown, they would use the apples in the cooking for the crew. not for the officers. So there is a way in which, having asked to eat the food the crew were eating rather than the food that the officers were eating, that gave me an exposure also to what was considered to be okay for the crew, but not for the officers. So the class, differences between the crew and officers was made really stark through their the habits of eating. An anonymous questioner says, I believe, thank you very much for your kind words. I believe you mentioned that these ships are transnational spaces, and I'm thinking of images of people on boats and jet skis blocking ships from delivering weapons to Israel and similar forms of disturbing choke points. How might the seafarers you interacted with in the labor hierarchy view such political actions? What factors affect how a crew can even respond? That's a really good question. So there is a when I was following all of the block the boat actions that were happening in European ports, but also in ports on the Western Seaboard in the United States, one of the things that in SeaTac, the activists were posting were images taken from Instagram account of one of the seafarers on the ship that was being blocked, who was saying that he felt really bad about being on board that ship. And he wished he hadn't been. And so I don't know whether, they can't get off the ship because he is, on a contract. So he is kind of bound to that. But it was interesting that he felt terrible about it. The fact of the matter is that most of the seafarers cannot have any control really on what kind of cargo a ship is carrying. Now, in those cases, these ships were ZIM ships, which are ships owned by an Israeli company. So perhaps that could allow seafarers a choice. But in a lot of instances, the ship could be just a random ship that is carrying a box of containers. And the only way you can actually find out what's inside those boxes for the general public is 2 or 3 days after that container has arrived at its destination. Now, people who actually have access to the bills of lading, which means people who work inside the companies, might know what's in those boxes long before everybody else does, if that ship is not like a ZIM ship or whatever. But seafarers don't. They don't know what is in there. The bills of once the bills of lading are given, you might know what's on board the ships, but not even then. Sometimes the boxes are just loaded with, a kind of a generic sounding recipient or sender on them. Now, there are in the book, I actually include another instance of political engagement by the seafarers, and that is where seafarers where seafarers in the Mediterranean have picked up migrants on sinking boats. And there have been there have been a large number of instances where seafarers on cargo ships have rescued migrants that were crossing the Mediterranean whose boats were in distress, brought them on board, and then their ships had been refused mooring at ports where they were supposed to moor at, which means that the seafarers were refused disembarkation after the end of their contracts. This was particularly a case, I write about this in my book, for a ship called merchant tanker Etienne. It was a Maersk ship, and they picked up a ship. They picked up a boat full of migrants that was sinking, and they were supposed to go and berth in Malta, and Malta told them to rescue the migrants. They didn't want, quite surprisingly, they didn't want the migrants to die. And once the seafarers did rescue them, they were refused berthing. And there's some really interesting accounts, which I also include in the book, by the captain and the crew of Etienne, who shared their food with the migrants, who tried to help them. There is a kind of an ethics at sea that you never let somebody who's drowning drown. And it is fascinating to me that commercial seafarers still adhere to that ethics, while port operators in the states of Mediterranean's Fortress Europe actually push back on these migrant ships. So there's a particular way that these seafarers are forced to be political, but those are long-standing traditions of the sea that force them into that politics.
Thanks. Danny, do we have more questions? Or I can ask one in the interim.
Yeah, I don't see any more, but
Okay.
people are welcome to raise their hand so that we can let them ask a question.
So I was wondering if you could talk to us about ethnography at sea as a sort of practice, because you referenced the ships as a semi-captive place. And by the end of your talk, I was thinking, well, it's like actually mostly a captive. There's not a lot of semi there. It's mostly a captive place. And I was thinking again of the sort of resonances with your earlier book in terms of that sort of focus on containment. So, you know, I think that for the researcher, that means the researcher is also captive in a way. And I'm wondering if that changes the way that you're able to relate to people, or it changes the way you practice your craft. You know, as an ethnographer, for example, somebody who's tried to do a critical ethnography of police, I've always been quite happy that I don't have to do it 24 hours a day, that I can leave the site of ethnography, whereas you can't.
Yeah. I have to say, if I had to do it again, this was probably in 20-something years of doing academic work, this was probably by far my favorite bit of research. I got to talk to these folks, but at the same time, I had my own space. There are different ways you can get on a ship, and that affects the ways in which you do your ethnography. So I got on the ship as a passenger. I bought my way on to the ship by paying, by going through a freight travel agent, which I highly recommend. If you guys are at all interested, you could do it, or at least you could do it before COVID. I think they are trying to pick it up again. But you could choose a trip that lasts something like a week, and then you can choose trips that last 3 or 4 months. So you could go as a passenger. And so as a passenger, I talked to everybody, and I told them all that I was writing a book, and I was completely honest about everything. And they were quite happy to talk to me. But of course, there are lots of things that I didn't include. As I said, I didn't, for example, include people's faces. I included no names, and there were things that were happening that were quite intimate between different members of the crew, which I didn't think it was my business to talk about. So, but the fact of the matter was that ultimately, the first time for 2.5 weeks and the second time for 3.5 weeks, I was on the same vessel with these guys, and I had to obey their rhythms. So as a passenger, you're supposed to have breakfast at 6, lunch at 12, dinner at 6, and if you don't show up at those times, then you're on your own. With breakfast, as I said, there's apples and boiled eggs that you can come down and grab it. And I didn't particularly care because I don't eat breakfast, but I never missed the lunch or dinner. The thing about it is that sort of a routine also introduces a rhythm of interaction, so that I would, for example, I would work out in the gym, I would spend some time reading and writing, and then I would go and spend 2 hours in the wheel room talking. I would have lunch, read and write, go for a walk on the deck, hang out, socialize, etc., etc. So that actually provides a really nice framework. And because I was a passenger, they were very happy to talk to me at all times, because in a way, we also, so on the first ship that I was on, I was one of 3 passengers. The other 2 passengers were 2 70-year-old German women who this was their 8th freighter trip. They only ever traveled by freight. And one of them said, yeah, we are the entertainment for them. They get bored, so they like having these other people that they can talk to. So that was my experience. But Charmaine Chua, an academic at UC Santa Barbara who does a lot of work on logistics, she also did a trip trans-Pacific on an evergreen ship, but she didn't go as a passenger. She actually went as a researcher. So she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement and various other kinds of things. And because she was there as a researcher, she asked the people on board if she could work. So she she has a fabulous story about how there was at some point bilge water had leaked into the sort of the front of the bow of the ship, and she had to go and empty out the bilge water, you know, and so you're like bent down, passing buckets of dirty water for hours, and she was like, she had, you know, so she had a very different experience than I did. I had a very bourgeois experience, maybe using Eileen's terminology, a very privileged experience, whereas she had the proper working experience. It creates different kinds of ethnography. So, but in both cases, you know, that I have maintained relations with a number of the seafarers that I was on board the ships with. I, you know, communicate with them all the time. There's a, you know, it's we sort of keep track of each other, particularly during COVID. And I think this is the same is true with Charmaine and the people that she met.
It's interesting to be with your research subjects for such a long period of time. And I mean, the let's start again question that you introduced at the end, I mean, it's such familiarity that it seems to almost breed introspection about whether or not you have it right. I think that's such a fascinating point that's much broader than your work, like the let's start again ethic. You know, do I have this right? What's another angle? How can I say this differently? You know, is this not just about a litany of suffering, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, and I think that is a question that I am always grappling with. I think everybody who does work with subaltern subjects will have a number of political and ethical questions about what you do, how you write, whom you write about, and what language you choose, and what framing you choose, and then what genre your work falls into. And I think that is, you know, the question of being aware of one's genres is the genre of speaking, or the way that we cleave automatically to what seems the easiest explanation. I mean, it's a good idea to be constantly questioning one's own certitudes. So
that's great. Thank you. Danny, should we do we have further questions, or?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap things up. Laleh, thank you for such a wonderful talk.
My pleasure.
We are going to store this online, and then all the other speakers that I mentioned at the beginning are going to be able to watch this and
great.
And see the sort of archive of your thoughts. And then when we all reconvene, we can talk about each other's talks and have a nice discussion. So thanks so much for joining us at Mershon today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks again for organizing everything. And it has been a pleasure. And thank you to Eileen and the anonymous questioner for their excellent questions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.